I'm Madison and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be explaining Omegaverse to you. So this was not a video that I ever really expected to make, but earlier this year I tried out Omegaverse for the very first time and made a whole video on it, and ever since then I've been reading a lot of Omegaverse because I adore it, and I always get questions from everyone on my videos whenever I read Omegaverse as to what it is, where should you start, how does it work, what is all these terms and things like that. And so I was asked if I could make a video, and so here I am. Am I wildly terrified about this video? Yeah, a little bit. Especially because I feel like there are definitely people who have been reading Omegaverse a lot longer than I have, but I'm kind of coming from it from my perspective as someone who only recently found out about this year and kind of how I understand it. And so without further ado, let me explain it. So with Omegaverse, there are two versions. There is shifter Omegaverse and there is non-shifter Omegaverse. So shifter Omegaverse is kind of when you think about where it originally came from, which is ABO, and that is from kind of normally werewolf shifters and a wolf pack mentality, because there are alphas and betas and omegas, and so initially it came from that area. And actually a lot of Omegaverse I feel like that people read tend to be fanfic and AUs, and you can find them a lot on things like Wattpad and AO3 is where I feel like a lot of people have read their Omegaverse, especially shifter Omegaverse comes from. And so again, shifter Omegaverse means that the people do shift into other creatures, and so they can be anything from wolf shifters to balloon animal shifters. Now if you're thinking, Madison, are you making up balloon animal shifters? I'm not making up balloon animal shifters. In fact, I just read a balloon animal shifter romance and it was amazing, but I will get to that later because it is also kind of weird. But we then also have non-shifter Omegaverse, and this basically is kind of the idea of just an alternate version of our reality where humans are part of the Omegaverse, in which case there are alphas, betas, and omegas, and it just means that their reproductive things are very much different. And I think that one of the best ways to also explain this with ABO, alpha, betas, and omegas is that alphas are doms, betas are very neutral, and then omegas are submissives. And that tends to also be kind of just, that's just the general hierarchy that works between them with alpha, betas, and omegas. And so with that being a dom sub relationship, that's also kind of what you see within the shifter and non-shifter Omegaverses. So I'm going to explain ABO from a non-shifter perspective. Alphas are the leaders of the pack. They are normally the strongest, and alphas have knots normally. Alphas more often than not are thought of as being men, and in a lot of Omega worlds it is very rare that there is a female alpha. Every world is different, but in a lot of the non-shifter Omegaverses, alphas will actually tend to form packs, and so they are the top of the society. They are the cream of the crop. They are the most powerful. They're the ones who are in positions of power. They have an alpha bark, and when an alpha barks, basically it is, it puts the others into submission around them, and the more powerful an alpha is, the more their bark works to put people into submissions, to listen to them. And this especially works with omegas. Okay, so after alphas, you then have betas. Now betas are basically. They don't have really strong pheromones. They don't give off a really strong scent. They have regular reproductive appendages. They're just normal humans. That's my understanding, at least in a lot of these. And they don't mate with anyone. Now, in a lot of non-shifter Omegaverses, this is the biggest difference in my opinion. In a lot of non-shifter Omegaverses, omegas are very coveted. There aren't a lot of omegas that exist, and they are kind of like a golden egg because they are the only people who can reproduce, and so they are very special in that sense where they're the only ones who can have the babies and continue on the bloodlines, and that is because of the fact of that their reproductive organ is made to accept the reproductive organ of an alpha. So the only way that an alpha can truly have proper sex is with an omega. But omegas are, in non-shifter Omegaverses, coveted for the fact of their entire purpose is to kind of, be looked after by their pack. I mean, and it can depend because some of them, will be rude to omegas because they think that omegas are just sex toys and sex slaves, because of the fact that omegas go into heat. And when omegas go into heat, they give off this scent and they become sex crazy. And they basically go on a 3-day sex bender with alphas. The scent that they give off is like a drug to alphas who instantly want to have sex as well with them. It's like a two-way street going on here. And going into heat is kind of like, in my opinion, like the equivalent of like going on your period, you know? It's basically a signal to like have sex, probably have babies, and to like do things in that way. And so because of that, you know, omegas are viewed in two different ways. They're either seen as just like, oh, they're just sex crazy creatures and they're like ruled by like their heat, or they're seen as like, oh my God, they're so precious because there's so few of them. They're the only ones that we can like look after. And omegas can whimper, and when omegas whimper, it is something that like alerts an alpha, and like an alpha will want to take care of a whimpering omega. And a alpha can actually purr and like reverberate in their chest, and that noise can calm an omega's whimper and make them feel comfortable. And an omega, when they're in heat, need a nest, and a nest is basically just like a really comfy place. Every omega is different, but they basically want to, the way that I've normally seen it is like, imagine like a room that is just full of like beds and pillows and is like a dark space that you can just like sit in and have a lot of sex, but also a lot of sleeping and cuddling in. That is what a nest is, and omegas require a good nest, and if they don't have a good nest, they get very anxious. And so it's like really interesting in that sense as well. At least in the ones that I've read, an omega can bond with multiple alphas, and when they do that, they kind of like are emotionally linked when that happens, and so they can feel the other person's emotions. And if that person is also bonded to someone else, they can actually kind of feel the other bonds that that person does have. So say you have person A, B, and C. Imagine that person B is bonded to persons A and C. That means that persons A and C, even though they aren't bonded to one another, they can still kind of feel each other's emotions just on a much, much lower level because of the bond that comes through person B. And so this is what happens with betas, because an alpha can bond with anyone they want. An alpha can bond with an omega or a beta, but it's not very common for betas to be bonded just because of the fact that like it tends to normally be omegas. And so an alpha will bond with an omega, and they do that by biting them, and that like injects something and it like leaves like a little mark. You can be bonded anywhere, and then that bond actually is increasingly sensitive, and it kind of almost becomes like a kink, to be quite, from everything that I've read, whenever they get bitten and have a bond mark, the bond mark is extremely kinky. Okay, so sometimes they'll bite them on like the ass, and then their ass becomes an extremely like sensitive kinky place. You know, it's however much fun you want to have with it. That's kind of that, and then packs will form. Now packs tend to only normally have one omega because it's difficult to satiate an omega, and omega normally needs multiple alphas and betas and like just people around them to satiate them during their heat because they just want to have sex consistently. Everything is different. All the different pack dynamics and all the different books that I read do vary. A lot of the non-shifter Omegaverses that I have read, packs tend to be built around a couple of different alphas with like one or two betas in it and then a single omega. But I have read some that are set in Omegaverse worlds where it is very rare for a pack to have more than one alpha. So it does vary depending on the book series that you do read. I personally don't like the ones that I've read where it's like a one alpha, a bunch of betas, and an omega. I don't like those ones so much. I like the ones where there's like a nice mixture between alphas and betas and an omega. And so it really does just depend on the book. To get into the sexual part of it, an omega and an alpha can rut. So an alpha can rut and knot an omega. Now knotting is the biggest kind of part of the Omegaverse, is knowing what a knot is. So I'm going to draw it for you. So a knot, I'm going to do this all from the perspective of it being like a heterosexual MF relationship with the alpha being a male and the omega being a female, because it is the easiest way to understand it. So why am I drawing this on the internet? So here we have the peen, okay? And on the peen, at the very, like not exactly at the bottom, that's where the hair is. But why am I drawing this on the internet? I hate myself. On the bottom here, you have what is basically like this like ring on the bottom. And this here is the knot, okay? And so this knot is what locks inside of an omega's vajayjay during intercourse, okay? And the knot can't fit normally into other people's who are not omegas places because they're not meant to fit the knot in it, because the knot can inflate and deflate. And when they start having sex and they rut, the knot inflates, and it inflates so much inside of the vajayjay that it locks inside, so they actually cannot like part from each other. And the purpose of that is for the breeding aspect, so that like, oh, it stays inside, so all of the So that is basically how that works. Obviously it does differ when you have a male omega and a female alpha. It's called a lock. I have not read a female alpha one yet. There is one that I'm reading actually next month, surprisingly enough. But the way that the lock works is it's kind of something that's like inside the vajayjay that like inflates and then locks the peen inside. It's like, maybe, I'm guessing it's like an internal knot almost. That is what knotting is, and that is, I think, the most common term that you really will hear from Omegaverse that people don't normally understand. And so that is my best way to explain it. Now, what I found about in a lot of shifter Omegaverses is that there's just like, it's a lot more degradation in shifter Omegaverses. Mates seem to be a huge thing that occur in shifter Omegaverses, and I guess it makes sense because mates are more of like that fantasy paranormal aspect of it. And you know, mates can be rejected. There's such a thing as like a rejected mate, in which case the bond is rejected, and that becomes like a whole issue because you're not, you know, your mate's your mate. If you get rejected, it's basically like this thing that like debilitates you almost. And in a lot of shifter Omegaverses, I've found that like the Omegas are treated really badly because they are viewed as like basically only being good for like sex. And another thing that I've kind of found that's like a sub-genre of all this, I think, is mpreg. Now, I have never read mpreg before. If you're wondering what mpreg stands for, that is male pregnancy. And that is the idea that in some of these Omegaverses, none of the ones that I've actually read, but in some of these Omegaverses, is that the male Omegas do have a uterus, I guess technically, and so they can get pregnant and have babies, but I've never read those before. I'm going to give you some recommendations now for Omegaverses. I actually have one that's a manga, I've got one that is a shifter Omegaverse, and I've got a couple that are non-shifter Omegaverses. So I think the way that I want to really start this is actually with my very first Omegaverse that I ever read, because I think it is actually the best introduction to Omegaverse because it actually explains everything to you from a non-shifter Omegaverse point of view, that you will be able to actually really understand how the world works. And that is Baby and the Late Night Howlers by Catherine Moon. This is Catherine Moon's sweet verse. So that's what her Omegaverse is called, is it's called the sweet verse, and it follows her sweet verse Omegaverse rules. Because like I said, every Omegaverse has its own rules, so hers is the sweet verse. And there's a whole bunch of these books. I recommend reading them all. They're all really fun. So this series has Baby and Late Night Howlers, which is about a beta who ends up presenting later in life as an Omega. So when I say that, I just realized I didn't explain this, but from a very young age, you're not automatically an alpha just because your parent might be an alpha, or because your parent's a beta, you're going to be a beta. Like, what happens is that you present during puberty. Like, when you have puberty, you present as either an alpha, a beta, or an omega, and that's just who you are. Omegas without a pack are in a very dangerous position because, you know, you can go through your heat and then you might be taken advantage of by like a different group. Someone might try and forcibly bond you, because that does happen in some of these, you know, you want to be bound to an omega and then they're like kind of your property also in a sense. And so you have to be very careful as an omega, and you basically need a pack to give you protection. And you can actually take heat suppressants, and these heat suppressants will make it so you don't go through your heat, so that you don't actually need to be part of a pack. But heat suppressants are also very bad for your body, and if you take them for too long, they can become very detrimental to you, and you can die from them in some of these Omegaverses. But you've got Baby. She finds out she's an Omega, and she ends up trying to find a pack, and she ends up meeting this really great beta guy one night, ends up meeting his pack, and his pack are the Late Night Howlers, and they are actually a motorcycle club that is also a pack, which is really cool. So it's like an MC one as well if you like motorcycle clubs. However, I also want to recommend, if you want to read a really short book that kind of like really instantly delves you into Omegaverse, there is also the Heat Haven Omegaverse. Now, Heat Haven is written by Sarah Blue. There are currently 3 books out. The 4th one is coming out. The 4th one's coming out at the end of November, and these are all very different, and I feel like these are very fun Omegaverses, and these are ones that I really love as well. So Heat Haven is a very short novella, so it is a great introduction if you don't know if you will like Omegaverse and just want like a little taste. It's like less than 100 pages. Heat Haven is a place in this universe where alphas and omegas can sign up to be part of Heat Haven, and it is like a facility that facilitates heats for people who are not in packs and need to like, you know, experience them, because omegas go through heat and they need a safe place to go through their heat, and that is what Heat Haven provides. And so book 1 is about this omega who goes for the very first time and this alpha who goes for the very first time. They end up getting trapped in an elevator together, and they really hit it off. Now, going into shifter Omegaverses, I have read some that I didn't really love, so I don't really want to recommend you the ones that I didn't enjoy. Weirdly enough, I'm going to recommend you a balloon animal shifter Omegaverse. It was actually very good, and I was highly surprised by this because I went into this thinking, oh, this is going to be hilarious and it's going to be a bad book. It was not. I actually really enjoyed it, and it shot the shit out of me because of that. So this book is called Squeak by Vera Valentine. You follow this girl, and she's an artist, and she's one day at this park, and you know, it's kind of like a amusement park kind of vibes, to be quite honest with you, and to this guy selling balloons. She meets him, they really hit it off, and turns out this guy is actually a balloon animal shifter. It's set in a universe where like shifters aren't like 100, like they're not fully known by everyone. They're kind of like on the DL. And these two guys are balloon animal shifters. They're boyfriends, and they escaped because they are shifters because there was this witch that like gave them magic that like made them shifters. And so they can shift back and forth from being balloon animals and into like being humans. But when they're like mid-shift, they're basically like transparent humans, and like their schlongs are like made from like latex balloons. And so that's a shifter Omegaverse that I read. It's a little strange. And like I said earlier, a lot of Omegaverse did get its start on AO3. So a lot of the shifter ones you will tend to find on those like more fanficky, Wattpaddy sites. So I don't have any recommendations on AO3 for Omegaverse because I never read those, but I'm pretty sure if you do just a search, you can probably find some of like top Omegaverses on AO3 if you are interested in shifter ones. But a lot of like non-shifter ones tend to be what you can find on like Kindle and stuff. Okay, and then lastly, here is my manga. This is I Become an Omega Today. This is another example of a alpha beta relationship where the beta then ends up finding out later that they're presenting as an omega. And so this follows these two guys who've been best friends since they were kids. One of them was an alpha, one of them was a beta, except for the fact that when this starts off, the beta ends up presenting as an omega. And so what ends up happening is like it like totally changes their dynamics, and they're both secretly been in love with one another, but we're like, we can't be together because I'm an alpha and you're a beta, and like an alpha has to be with an omega. And so it's the two of them, it's their romance. So I do recommend it if you want something that's a manga, and it is an MM one as well. Super cute, by the way. So I hope I did a good job with this. I was really worried about this video. I don't even know what it's going to be like when I go to go edit this, because I tried my hardest, but I really feel like there are going to be people out there who are like, you didn't explain everything, or like you missed something, and I'm really sorry if I missed something. Like I said, I've only been reading Omegaverse this year, and I've only read probably like 10 at this point. Have I heard more than 10? I think I've read 3 and 3 is 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, I probably read like 10 to 12 Omegaverses this year, so I'm trying, I'm still learning, and you can keep following me for more of these, but I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please let down below. If you want to see more of me, please go to my channel, and don't forget to check me out over on Instagram and TikTok, and until next time, thanks a bunch everyone, bye bye!